All right, so I'm taking this video here because I know there's a lot of questions usually on our page about what to do. So this is a phalaenopsis orchid that Mo dropped off at my house to be repotted. So a couple of things that I want to point out here. So this orchid has basically no living root system.
How can you tell that?
I can tell that because it's spongy and like soft to touch. Okay, and like I can show you guys a real nice root later. But essentially a real root should be turgid, right? It should be hard. And this is all just dead husk of root. See, it literally just came off just by me even touching it. So, and remember that these need to be hard enough to actually like hold the plant up, right? In natural life.
Like a
so
tree,
yeah. Okay, so a couple of other things that, this plant was probably overwatered. And the way that I can tell that is that you see quite a bit of like black stuff here near the base. We see some evidence of rot here with this black stuff. A little bit of evidence of rot at the root of at the very bottom of the spike. And then I see a bunch of like little tiny, like it put out new roots at one point, but didn't actually grow them out. That's right here. Okay, so this orchid needs a radical trim back. Probably not. We'll see if it survives. It's going to be a tough one because it doesn't even have one living root right now. So I'm going to trim it all the way back, and then I'm going to try to excise any of the rot that I can see. And then I'm going to use some, most likely I'll use some rooting hormone to see if I can prompt it to actually grow roots in a much smaller pot. So just to give you an idea, this is the pot it was in. Not enough ventilation. Usually you'd want holes all around the outside of the pot. And it was probably overwatered or left wet for too long. Orchids need a lot less water than you think. All right, cool. So let me go cut it and I'll be back. All right, so I got my trusty cookie sheet that I use for these things. I don't cook on it. Because I have evidence of rot on this orchid, and in fact, it even smells like rot. I actually got a glass of water that again, not a cup I use for drinking, and I'm going to be using Physum 20. This is a bactericide, fungicide. It's pretty nasty stuff. So always dilute it, leave it away from kids and stuff like that. I put a little glug of it in the water there. I'm going to use it to, first of all, clean my shears because these are actually the shears I use for all my plants. So I don't want to infect them. And so I'm getting them clean first, and I'll clean them again at the end. And we're basically going to cut back all the dead material because anything that's dead can turn into rot. And then we are going to put this orchid in this really little pot. I've had great success with these pots. I forget what they're called, but like oxygen pots or something. I bought them online. And we're going to use a coarse media to try to re-root the orchid using a rooting hormone. So usually I would not use this, but I think we're really about to cut off all of the roots on this orchid. So basically anything that feels dead needs to be cut. So you can really just get in there and start cutting. Roots that are healthy and alive when you cut them, if you ever cut one on accident, they will have like a green smell, and they will feel alive. This stuff you can really see in there. It's all dead, all black in there. So no question that this orchid, we're having like radical surgery to try to save its life. Yeah, look at that. All went down. And you can even see, like, look at that, like algae or rot really growing right there, right? That black stuff. So let's actually get in there. We're going to cut back the spike. This spike will not flower again. First of all, the orchid's clearly in distress because it doesn't have a root system. And second, As you can see, it's already started turning brown, so it will not spike again. We want to get in as close to the base as we can and just cut it off. You can also see a live spike will be greenish on the end. This one's clearly brown. Okay, so now comes a kind of harder decision, which is like, do we cut back more down here, like where I see more evidence of rot? In this case, I'm actually going to choose maybe not to. I'm going to get like quite close. Try to cut back as much as possible. I have to really get in there. And then I'm going to dunk this orchid actually in the phison for a bit. The phison is just soap, so it'll be fine. You wouldn't want it living in here like for a long time, but basically I want to like wash off any and kill any bad stuff that's on there right now. Again, radical, right? You would not do this usually if your orchid is doing well, but this is a radical choice to try to save this plant. All right, so in a moment I'll show you how to repot it. Okay, so this is, I did a little bit more cleaning on the orchid. This is what it looks like. I've now rinsed it in phison. I've then rinsed most of the phison off with water. I tried to, I took a careful look. Whoops. I took a careful look at, the base of the orchid actually looks okay. I don't see any evidence of rot here, especially once I pulled back. Basically, you can think of anything that looks dead on an orchid, right? Like, is a place for rot to grow, especially if it's in a warm and wet condition. So again, tiny little pot. Remember, when you're potting an orchid, this is actually even a little big. You're potting the root. You're not potting the orchid. So the orchid is bigger, much, much bigger than the pot. And I decided actually, rather than using the wood chip mix, I'm actually going to use some of this coconut husk, which I think will hold a bit more water. The whole idea of this pot actually is that it creates like humidity in the round area and encourages root growth. So start off with just some regular, no phison, just regular water in this this bowl here. I'm going to add some of this coconut husk in there and get it really saturated. So like as wet as it can possibly get. And, this is from one of my favorite stores, repotme.com. There are lots of different options, though. I like them. That's where I get all my orchid stuff. But, okay. So this stuff is getting really wet. It's pretty coarse, though, so I may still, break it apart a bit just to get a little bit smaller pieces, especially since this orchid actually doesn't have a root system right now. I'm trying to make sure it's nice and humid where I'm going to put it so that it will hopefully grow some roots. So now I'm going to very carefully use some of this rooting hormone. Again, it's like a little bit nasty. I'm not super into it, but in special cases, it's worth doing. So I'm just putting a tiny amount of it on the orchid. Usually I use this stuff, that's why I don't like using it. Usually I use this stuff more to root like cuttings, right? So like a cutting from the from one of my big plants over there, the fiddle leaf fig. I've had a couple of different cuttings, so I have a bunch of new plants from those, and this is a different use case than my usual. Yeah, just make sure I'm definitely gonna wash my hands after this, obviously. Okay, so now that we have the stuff here, put it on there and, hope that it will grow new roots. Now we're gonna take the pot, let me go actually rinse my hands, one sec. All right, my hands are clean. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm basically gonna take this little pot, I'm gonna line it with some of this wet coconut husk. Just basically trying to make a little bed for my little nub. And the idea is that we will create a really nice environment for some new roots to take hold. So I'm just kind of sticking it in there. Okay. And I'm gonna clean off any additional rooting hormone that I accidentally got on the plant. Sorry, plant. And the rooting hormone does take action in like, you know, humid, like wet locations, like basically the, you know, the open wounds, not to be overly dramatic, but the open wounds of the orchid that we opened earlier. And I'm really sticking a good amount of media in there. This media is quite, as I mentioned, quite coarse. It's probably not what I would have selected if I had chosen to do this, right? And it wasn't an emergency. So I'm sticking it in there really because I want it to create quite a moist environment. The coarser the media, the more airflow it naturally has. So the more you have to kind of push it in if you want to create a more moist environment. All right, so this is my new orchid. Now think I'm gonna put it under a bag. So be right back. So we got our plate, which is an old plate from an IKEA plant that I rescued at some point. Have our little pot with our orchid in it. The orchid is relatively stable, even though it doesn't have a root system. I'm gonna use these two small stakes here. Usually I would use these for a spiking orchid, but what I'm gonna use them for here is actually to bag this orchid in a Ziploc bag, which I'm hoping is gonna fit. And the idea is to create a place that is conducive to growth and growing. So now, and humidity. Because remember that the coconut husk I put in there is wet. So we're gonna take it over to what will be a sunny location. I've had a lot of luck rooting things in this area, though not this time of year. So let's see what happens. Okay, so by comparison, this is a healthy orchid. It was not repotted this year, but you can see, first of all, it has many leaves. The many leaves are supported by what you can see is a huge root system that in fact is growing, you know, all over the place out of the pot too. Look at how many healthy roots, and each root is hard. Like when I touch it, they're currently dry right now, so they're not wet because it's just a couple days away from watering it probably. But you could see that they're quite hard. They're turgid. They feel green. They feel alive. So this is an example, just as an example, see it can look slightly silvery and smooth too, of a much healthier orchid root system. Even so, right, like I still repot an orchid like this once every year or two, because sometimes the roots on the inside can become dead and you don't want to harbor rot. So yeah, same idea, but you can see how much air these types of pots let through. Very different and very much trying to fight the, you know, potential rot that these orchids can experience.